Finding Hope from Brokenness to Restoration. If you're like me, you might feel broken physically, emotionally. You might see brokenness all around you in the world. Heidi's going to help us today to recognize the brokenness, to name it, and then point us to hope that we have, even in the midst of all the messes that might be piling up in your life. Well, we're glad you joined us. If you have questions for Heidi as we're talking, she would love to answer them. So drop your questions in the chat and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And I would encourage you to share this video with others that you know who could benefit from the conversation so that they can be brought in to the conversation and be led ultimately to hope, which we all need and we have. How are you, Heidi?
I'm awesome. It's a good day. It's a good day.
It is a good day. Congratulations on the release of your new book. Show everybody Finding Hope.
I have it here too.
You have it too, and you match. You're dressed. You're dressed to match.
Ooh, yes.
It's very, very well done.
It matches your book. I mean, that's good.
So it's exciting. How do you feel?
I feel really good. It's funny because this book, it feels like a very long time in coming. It is definitely a good foundational piece for a lot of the research I do about shame and grace and the relationship between the two, as well as what that looks like in us and around us with topics like anxiety and fear and family trauma and things like that. And so I started this book. I started the research for this book long ago, but I started really an outline for this book about 3 years ago, before Mighty and Mysterious even. And you can see some of the basic pieces of shame and grace in Mighty and Mysterious as well, and some charts and things like that. Thank you, Alex, in the graphics department at CPH. And so it feels so good to let it out into the world. I think I thought I would be really nervous about it because it's a vulnerable thing to try to do research and then compile some ideas and make it sensical for people and matter, I guess, helpful in some way. But I feel less nervous, I think, than I just feel so excited for it to be held in hands and hopefully for people to pass it around, because I hear this question, and the original title for the book that I submitted a proposal for and stuff was, can someone clean up around here? Messes in life. And I that's the question I feel like people are asking all the time. Like, can someone just clean up around here? It's so challenging to live in a world that feels so messy all the time. And then we feel that in our own internal selves, and that brings on a whole nother set of questions. But when we got down to it, the book is about hope. It's about finding that hope in the messes. And so I'm really glad with where we landed. But I'm excited for people to ask that question a little bit more honestly with the people around them.
Well, there have been plenty of times where I've kind of thrown up my hands and I've said, could somebody just take over for me for a little bit? Could you just kind of fix it all and then let me start with a clean slate so that I don't have to deal with the mess and with the problems? But so far, nobody stepped up to do that yet.
No one's going to do that for you. They got their own stuff, Elizabeth.
I know everybody does. Everybody has their own stuff. And so for our listeners who are joining us, if you have questions for Heidi about messes of life, brokenness, what brokenness looks like around you, please drop those in the conversation so that we can respond to those and have those real life examples, because it's a real thing for everybody. And it's, as Heidi mentioned, it's can be very vulnerable to talk about, but the more we start talking about it, the more we come together, the better we can help each other and the better we can point each other to our hope. So feel free to jump in the chat and let us know that you're here. Sarah McKinley says, woo, she's saying hi, Heidi.
Yay. Yeah, Sarah was one of our early readers for the book. And she also was someone who helped me sort through the book. I am so thankful for the people listed. Make sure you go all the way through to the last pages, because I'm thankful for those people who sat around campfires or listened to me through text messaging or whatever to try to find a way to talk about brokenness that I would in my therapy office and be authentic to that, I think, but also how I would talk to my friends and but help it in an orderly fashion that fits within 150 or so pages,
Christy Steffen says that she loves like, somebody please clean up around here. So
Right.
it's all good.
Well, and I think we have to be honest with God about that question too. And that's, really part of the first part of Finding Hope. It's organized in different segments, and just being honest and saying, hey, God, this is challenging for me, and I need you to address this. I wonder where you are in this mess.
So Laura asks the question, which I think plays very nicely with what you just started to say, is how do we admit that we're broken?
Oh, I think
So
that's good.
how can we recognize the brokenness? I'll take it one step further, but how can we recognize the brokenness, and how can we admit that we're broken?
Yeah, I think part of it is, and I talk about this a little bit on my Instagram videos, if anybody wants to check out my Finding Hope Instagram series that I started over there too, but I think that for so long, the only language we've had for brokenness is sin. Like, oh, I'm a sinner and you're a sinner. And to some degree, we know that's not quite enough. Number one, that isn't quite the whole story. And also there's just a lot of shame if that's all we have, that I'm creating messes and other, it's shame or blame, or you're creating the messes. Instead, in Finding Hope, we identify 4 different ways that brokenness impacts our lives. And it's certainly connected to the Garden of Eden. It's certainly connected to that original space where sin first entered the world. Doubt and shame itself also first entered the world, but God met them in that, and God meets us in that. And so one thing I propose is that the awareness of our brokenness is its own kind of brokenness. This fact that we are vulnerable to God, because at one time we were just with God. And we were vulnerable that whole time, but being able to still be that vulnerable self with God and one another is a really powerful part of hope that is hard in the brokenness. And so I think, Laura, an answer to your question is, number one, understand that brokenness isn't just you, it's everything. And it's the whole system. It's the whole of creation, right? So it's not just who I am before God, it's how the universe is before God. And it's going to be messy then. It's just truth. It isn't something that God just heaps on shame for. That's not his jam. Instead, when you look at Genesis 3, what does he do? He enters in and he asks, hey, where are you? Stop hiding. I'm right here. And that's what we want for ourselves too.
Christy just chimed in. I like how she said, we're still hiding ourselves under fig leaves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When God gives us something so much better, right? This is hope that God clothes us in his own righteousness. That's wild. And we don't have to remain vulnerable before God only. We also receive that clothing from him, and that changes the relationship. There's that reciprocity that we get from that, and then we can give to each other too. I think that's the other piece of it, Laura, is admitting we're broken is one part of our sense of self. And that's the first section of Finding Hope. But then it's also something we do in relationship with other people. So in Finding Hope, we work through how that's complicated in family units, in romantic relationships, in friendship, and then in communities with injustice around us. And then the whole of creation groaning alongside of us. I know that Elizabeth, that's one of my favorite pieces of Finding Hope, is the fact that the grass underneath my feet has as many problems as I do. That is a really good place to be with brokenness, is that it's not just me.
So I've got a couple of comments that have just come in, and it's funny you mentioned groaning. I was just talking to Christina Hergenrader, and she brought up that same verse and the groaning, and it's God hears it all. Mm-hmm. So Jamie says she definitely sees this plays out in human relationships too. How can she encourage people to be vulnerable with her?
That's a really good question. Number one, we talk about a whole section on vulnerability, and so I encourage you to understand vulnerability a little bit better. And I think the fact that vulnerability existed before sin existed is really important for us to enter into vulnerability a little bit with that sense of a purpose and what we call humble confidence, like in the grace of Christ Jesus. So that's one thing. Get familiar with it. The second thing is get familiar with your own stuff and your own messes. It's really hard. I think we can be there for other people when we're not dealing with our own stuff and we've somehow done them a service. But the reality is that we will throw out our stuff when other people are trying to share with us if we do not deal with it. The third piece of that, in answer to that question, is use phrases like "tell me more" and "I noticed," instead of advice giving or things that convey some amount of judgment. Even like, "You've got this, you're doing a great job." That can be really helpful, but understanding that we may not have all the answers to that situation and how that's going down for them. Those other phrases that ask for more information first are really, really helpful for the relationships around this. Release that shame.
Well, taking that step to not just be superficial with the relationship, but to really be willing to enter in. Sarah,
just like God in Genesis 3.
There you go. So Sarah mentioned that she's shared hope with students where she's had to hold and learn how to hear and hold the brokenness in their lives and mine. And so I think that goes along with what you're saying. So
yeah, that word "hold" is powerful. We're going to do that together. Like, I'm never going to take it from you. I think we also think we can do that. I'll hold your mess for a little while. But the reality is that doesn't help us, and it definitely doesn't help that person. So being able to hold it together is really powerful. Thanks for that reminder, Sarah.
So Ken hit us with a question that definitely goes to brokenness that we may see in community. And as he shares, he says that he often feels that social media is broken. Wouldn't it be great to uplift each other rather than tearing each other down?
Oh man, it would, wouldn't it? And it is possible. I think that's the thing is, one thing we've done in our culture today is like fall into this belief that somehow technology and social media are more broken than our other spaces. Like they're the problem, right? Because they're so broken. And it is true. Ken's 100% right that social media is a hot mess. However, it's just that I think there's some removal of real relationship in some ways and other dynamics going on where we simply see the mess a little bit easier than we do. We're so busy hiding it when we're with each other that we stuff it deep down, or we're not as honest as we would be. There's probably some grace in that and also some danger in that. And so social media can be a good place. Technology can be such benefit to us, to our young people, to community, which we've learned through COVID, right? COVID showed us a lot of the mess, but also the goodness and the joy in it. And so again, I think just like holding people's brokenness, we're going to hold those things together at the same time. The brokenness and the hope on social media. When we take one out, when we're just like Pollyanna-ing it, when someone's having a struggle, that's not going to help. And then when we're also only sharing brokenness, only throwing that out, that's not helpful either. Both together at the same time.
I love what Trevor Sutton says, and he said this in a few places, and in his new book coming out later this year, he asked the question. He says, when you sit down to use technology, take your piece of technology, whose glory are you using it to? Are you using it to uplift God, or are you using it to uplift yourself? And that's a distinction that I have found rather compelling, because it should give a person pause, gives me pause before putting something out there. I'm like, why am I really doing this? And I think that goes to what you're saying. Like it can be a way that it's not inherently bad, but we do need to think about how it's being used as we go along. So there are the four different realms that you talk about brokenness, and you start with brokenness in ourselves, in our identity. Where do we see that? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think in therapy world and social work and counseling, we talk about the sense of self. And I think in Christianity, there's some pushback to that. But God created us heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit in the book and what that means. I think being in tune to all four of those things inside of us is part of sense of self. And so we especially deal with these topics like what is vulnerability, the messiness of emotions inside of us, mostly because that's something we're not really talking about, especially in our spiritual lives, and resilience and the value of not only resilience, but the wrestling that's assumed with resilience, and then body image too, and that broader idea of body image. One thing after I wrote All Together Beautiful, my study of Song of Songs, I was amazed at how many first older women and also men came up to me of all different ages and said, I struggle with body image. And it's a different version of body image than I think is in our heads when we say that. So taking off the cultural ideas for a second and being honest that body image encompasses a whole lot more, including our health, and the body that breaks down and doesn't obey, the body that is presented with infertility or loss of a child, the body that just doesn't do what we want, doesn't have enough energy for something. So we're going to talk about those things as far as sense of self goes. Heart, soul, mind, and strength is where we'll land on that.
I was joking earlier with someone. I said, my body's completely broken. They're like, "Oh, you've been broken since you were in your early 20s." I'm like, well, that may be that may be very true, but some days you feel it more than others.
Yeah.
I find it interesting as you talk about thinking about it all and the identity. We had the chance to hear you talk locally in St. Louis recently. And I told you the story afterward, but my 15-year-old came up to me afterwards and was like, "Are you okay?" Like being in tune with the other person. "Are you doing all right? You look like you could use someone to talk to. Are you sure you're all right? You can talk to me. I've been trained." And he was being a little smarty pants. But what I recognized is that he listened more. That, how teenagers are, right? But he picked up on what you were talking about as you were going through the pieces of Finding Hope. And I have caught him, whether he realizes he's doing it or not. He's been asking more often, "You okay?" And and actually like going down that path. So I found that interesting with different things, like how they pick up and how just that awareness and that looking around can be so powerful.
Well, and asking it as a real question instead of like the grocery store clerk question. We talk about that at the beginning of Finding Hope, when I sat down on a therapy couch with my own therapist and said, I'm fine. I'm so fine. I can taste it. I'm so fine.
Feelings I'm not expressing.
Yes. Like fine isn't working. Right. And so instead being honest about the brokenness so the hope can come in, calling it by name is the goal. Like finding the things of brokenness that are in our own life, because yes, brokenness is real for all of us, but it looks different for all of us. We have our own unique experiences. And so calling those by name can be really helpful so that we can see the breed of hope that we need. Jesus is the big hope. He's redeemed, he's restored, he's coming back for us, all things. However, we need tiny pieces in order to get there a lot of the time and each day. And so he offers that as well. And that's what calling brokenness by name does, is we can see the breed of hope that we need for that thing in our life.
And it really is, it takes some intentionality on our part to realize that the other person's experience is different than ours. Their brokenness looks different than ours, and what they need is going to be different than what we may need. And again, it goes back to, we need that intentionality, and being in relationship is so important. So you start with brokenness in ourselves, which, there's plenty there for us to get real with and to really take a close look in the mirror at ourselves. But then you go to another really sticky subject, and that's brokenness in families and in relationships. And
And it's funny because I thought this idea of like family of origins, like the fact that we all came from a family, however messy it is, however awesome it is, we all came from a family, and that's going to affect how we view the world, how we receive romantic relationships, how we parent our kids, how we interact. In all of our places and spaces. But evidently that's not common knowledge. Like, I think people kind of understand it, like, oh yes, I was raised in a family and they believed this, and here's our traditions, and I'm trying to pass these on. But there's way more to it than that. And so we really talk about that concept. What is our family of origin? What did we learn? Being vulnerable with that, honestly admiring the awesome parts of it, but being honest about the brokenness, because your family has issues, my family has issues, we all got some issues. And I think so often, especially in the Christian church, we don't want to speak poorly of someone. So we're so busy trying to talk about how great our families are that we forget to talk about the imperfections and the struggles, and that it doesn't help. It's not real then either. We're not tending to what we need to tend to. So we
Especially
do
for
that.
especially if we're adding that layer of, the Instagram worthy photos or the shareable kind of patina of what life looks like.
Mhm.
It can be easy to fall into the trap of that family has it all together. Those folks have it all together. As you said, we all have our issues, and they're probably as long of as each of our arms. And they're all different, and they're all worth exploring, because there's still hope. There's still hope even in the messiness of all of that.
Well, there is. And one thing that trauma does, and there's a whole lot of trauma in the world out there, you guys. We're going to talk about that in the book too. And I'm sure there's more writings coming on that too. I have them stored up somewhere inside of me. But is that we tend to see just only trauma then too. So when we look at our families, we're like, oh, I don't want to do what they did. And, there's a lot of judgment in that. And so we want to be able to hold those two together. That helps us to come at it with Jesus's redemption and restoration alive and well in it. Be honest about the trauma and struggle, but also be confident about the hope of it. Hold both things together.
So we cover things like the brokenness in ourselves, brokenness in relationship. What's another area where there's brokenness visible?
Yeah. So the next one is community. So that's the third realm, is community. And these are like concentric circles, if you picture them, right? Brokenness in self, brokenness in our family, and then we go a little wider, brokenness in our communities. And in that section, we especially tackle friendship, because that is universally a struggle. I've learned when I first started doing my work with pastors' wives in particular, that was something that people really admitted in the research was a huge vacuum that felt like they just could not find good, solid friendships. And then as I started to pan out in my therapy practice and in writing and speaking, this is a universal struggle. And it's a struggle for men, it's a struggle for women, it's a struggle for all of us. And so being honest about what friendships look like, as well as what we might need from them and how they're built. We're going to look at that a little bit. How do we build friendship? How do we reach out for friendship and continue to grow friendship? Then we talk about the body of Christ. Because wow, it's a little messy. And I've had my own struggles with that and confronting the mess and what to do with it. And I hear from people all the time that they need an honest conversation just about the messiness of the body of Christ, instead of, well, it's full of sinners. Yes, that's true. But let's take it a little further. What is that brokenness, and how can we call it by name to get to the hope? Call it by name to get to the hope. And then we'll also talk about social injustice, the injustices we see around us in our community, all the isms that are alive and well around us, racism, sexism, you name it. And so how does God care about those things? And also, we talk about the words integration and disintegration. And so you can just look for that in the book. That's kind of a complicated concept that runs throughout the book. So that is the third section.
So on the community topic, Anna mentions, she says that in the section on community, she loved the quote where you say, "We are not better people as Christians. We simply know a better love." Can you
Mm.
talk about, can you talk more about what that means for us as we reach out to others, maybe even our friends who might not be Christians?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is part of it, is that non-judgmental stance, that place where this is what we got. We got God's love. And we have other gifts, right? We have truth. We have the scriptures. We have God's gifts that he gives us in the church. However, the thing that is different than anything else, that stands above and through all of those things, is God's relentless love. I know Charla just wrote about that in Hosea, and that word is so important in identifying the way that God interacts with us with his love. And so we I think we think that we're delivering the gospel so often by sharing truth. But when we forget the love, it's not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere. And so I think, especially in spaces where people don't know Jesus, we can love louder and bigger and believe that God will do his work through that. And truth will have its space. But love on the front end, love in the middle, and love on the back end, I think that's a really powerful thing.
It's incredibly powerful. And you hit the nail on the head when you talk about, we can identify the brokenness to someone, but if we're not doing that cloaked in love,
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to help them move forward to finding that hope.
Yeah, and I know I think we all do it because we just desperately want them to know the truth. And back to Ken's question, happens on social media, especially all the time. And one problem with social media is that it's so hard to transmit that love. It doesn't come out as clear as like when we see facial expressions and when we're having an ongoing conversation. But I think that we can believe, just go back to scripture, friends. We can believe that God is love. Like, it is his actual character, and he's going to work in that. And the other stuff, he's going to give space for that. He's going to help us be honest about brokenness and bring truth to the matter. But we have to have love wrapped all around it.
Tell us about the brokenness all around us in creation. We've gone
Mm-hmm.
narrow and now we're going wide to creation. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is really became so alive for me when I studied my mysterious in the book of Colossians and my work in Genesis, like coming together. It is freakishly comforting that I am not the only thing impacted by sin, but that everything around us is. And Romans 8 is really the heart of this chapter, and brings it all together, that all of creation is groaning, waiting in that hope of Jesus. Like, God, when the birds cry out, they are crying out, asking God to come back for us and to solve this brokenness and to wrap us in that love completely, as we know it in tiny pieces, right? Paul says, as I know in part now, one day I shall be fully known and I will know fully. And I think that when we hear when we hear about earthquakes, we hear about natural disasters, when we hear about disease, when we hear about COVID, when we hear about cancer, all these problems that we feel so powerless against, to know that they are also, all of that is because of the impact of brokenness in this world. And there is disintegration in that. However, God is at work. He sees it, he knows it, he's entering it. There's pieces of restoration, right? We've all had a friend that's, been cured of cancer. We've all had a friend who has been released from the hospital from something. However, we're not quite there yet with full restoration. And that's where hope comes in. We're waiting, and we know that God is faithful and he's going to be in it, but he's going to show up big time one day. And that will be a joyous day where all that completeness comes. And all of creation is really impacted by that. And everything will be made new. When you get to that section in the book, I think this is something we've kind of forgotten in the Christian church. I don't know why we put it away a little bit. But we forget to remind people when they're grieving and struggling in loss in particular, that God's going to make everything new again. It says there'll be a new heavens and a new earth. There's not just heaven. And sometimes I think people need that promise to their brokenness, that everything will be made new. Not just me, not just my soul, but everything is going to be made new again. And that's a huge promise of restoration that brings hope for people.
But it is, and it's a great way for us to keep our eyes focused on that as we walk through things, to know that there is that great restoration that will be coming, bringing us hope.
Yeah, I think that makes it easier to see the little restorations each day in our life. You know, we can see them a little bit more clearly when other people point them out to us too. Sometimes it's going to be really hard in my brokenness to see it, and I need you to help me with that.
That's a great way that we can help each other too, is when we see those, if we recognize that a friend is struggling with something, and we do see those little glimmers of restoration, to remind them, because like you said, it can be an aha moment. I think there's so much food for thought and so much to dig into in finding hope. How do you see individuals or groups using this in a way that it's not a means to an end, but it's a starting point for bigger conversations and more in-depth conversations?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways to do that. You know me, I'm all about like, let's do this grace-based. So however it works for you. I think reading it for yourself is step one. Like, I think we do this sometimes as we hand stuff to other people when we need to deal with our own stuff.
Here, I think you really need to read this book.
You need to read about brokenness. No. And so, like, you know, take a moment to be honest about your brokenness and be honest about the hope that God is bringing into that. And I know that will be a really good foundational place to be with it. But then I really hear all the time people who say, when I use the word brokenness and kind of describe it a little bit, that's a word they've been looking for their whole life, that's a word they didn't know was a thing. And so I think being able to say, hey, there's a word for what you're experiencing other than you're a sinner, or the shame that comes with that at times, that can maybe wrap this in better language for you. I think that's a great person to give finding hope to. And yes, of course, you can just give it to someone. That's awesome. You can also discuss it with that person, or share it together. You can then, I definitely think, you know, it's funny because when we were trying to design the structure too, this is not a Bible study. It's not a Bible study.
I was going to say, this looks vastly different than your other writings.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's going to be different for some of the readers that are used to picking up my stuff. I'm really excited because I think it makes it more usable for more people. And my voice as an author, I think, is really helpful for people on the margins. Like, that's where I kind of live in my life. That's who I am in tune to the most, is people kind of on the margins of faith. And so I pray that it's really especially useful to have conversations with people who aren't as well connected to Christ or the church and things like that. That said, it's got plenty of Bible in it. And so, you know your audience and what they're ready for. But whether sharing quotes, I think we're in the next year probably going to pour out a ton of quotes on social media and stuff to make those shareable things with other people as well. But there is a reader's guide in the back. So great for discussion in Bible study groups, or great for discussion in book groups, or with coffee with a friend, or with your spouse. Some stuff that's good for just chatting around the table, bringing up tough topics with your teens. Someone just asked me in my office today if this was good for teens or young adults. And I said, absolutely. I really believe the content is helpful. I'm hoping in the next year also then to come out with some youth specific questions for it as well.
I could see, having seen how my oldest in particular responded after listening to your talk, like some of the questions in the reader's guide would be great just for pull one question out over dinner and just talk about it as a family. Would be a way to kind of broach some of those topics. I know my congregation has formed several book clubs, book groups, and are coming together across the congregation to read it as we think about how mental health affects all of us. So it'll be exciting to see how all that plays out. So you mentioned at the beginning a little bit of the vulnerability that you felt and how it was different. This was a different writing process for you. I think Finding Hope lands in your sweet spot as far as your career and ministry and work go, as a deaconess in the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, and as also a licensed social worker. So it really does bring it together in a unique way. But just tell us a little bit about the process and recap for those who might have missed it at the beginning about what on earth you felt as you were writing this.
Yeah, it was so hard for me. I had this idea. Like I said, that question that kept coming up, like, can someone just clean up around here? And wanting to say that before a God that I knew was good, but also, well, if you're good, there are all these spaces in my life I don't see it. So help me be able to understand that a little bit better, or at least be in it. And, be in a more content place with that. And always like reaching and longing for God instead of turning away, because that's so easy to do when we see the mess. And we also will talk about those responses within our bodies and in our families and things like that too. So then I just started writing notes of all the messes. Okay, here's a mess 1, here's a mess 2. Let's go for mess 47 and mess 827. And you know what? You can't make a book about 800 different messes. Like, that will not work.
It'd be an anthology of mess.
Yeah, I mean, you would be committed. It's like War and Peace over here with Heidi Goehmann. And so I asked my friend Sarah Hoffman, who's also a CPH author and my lifelong writing partner since, a long time. So just how do I bring this in? How do I make this something that is going to be helpful for people instead of overwhelming for people? Because the messes are overwhelming. And so we spent a little bit of a weekend in Austin, Texas. I was there for something else, and we sat beside a pool and figured out what it might look like. And that was a huge part of the process for me. I came back and it still was basically notebooks upon notebooks, just with sheets falling out, because it was still overwhelming. And God, like he does in our own systems, writing is a refining process. That's one benefit of editing, but I think God does that first, and he just starts to shave off pieces and point you with the Holy Spirit to the things that really need to be said and brought out. And the concept of integration and disintegration is really kind of the heart of what we experience in ourselves, in our families, in our communities, and in all of creation. And so I started with that. Thank goodness a pandemic hit, because then I just had, 3 months in my house to be like, I guess we're going to write a book, God. And that was a unique experience too, writing in a pandemic. I think it really helped me stay focused and centered, because there's so much obvious brokenness around us that needs some attention. And so I'm thankful to God for his weird timeline I never would have chosen. And then we got to the hope, and I'm really thankful for Jamie, my editor, everybody in marketing at CPH. This concept could have overflowed into 8,000 things that weren't going to make sense. And instead, every step of the way, people kept bringing it back into brokenness and hope, brokenness and hope. And how can we hold those things together?
So we dropped a link in the chat to the landing page for the book, cph.org/findinghope, where listeners can download a sample. They can learn more about it, and they can head over and order the book if they would like to. And I think everyone would benefit from reading the book. You are a rather prolific writer. You put out a lot of content on mental health and pointing folks to Jesus and all of it. Where can our listeners connect with you?
Absolutely. You can always find me at my website, HeidiGoehmann.com. And y'all are in a unique position because you can see how my name is spelled across the screen right there. So you're going to want to just jot that down. It's a little hard to find. But HeidiGoehmann.com, you can find other resources on mental health, genuine relationships, and hope there. And I think, you can go to my Facebook, Heidi Goehmann Writes. YouTube is also Heidi Goehmann Writes. I have videos there dropping most months. Instagram, you can find me at Heidi Goehmann, or Snapchat, Heidi Adventures. But if you go to HeidiGoehmann.com, you'll find all the other stuff, and it's a great place to start.
Check it out, viewers. I hope you take some time and connect with Heidi, because I think you'll find a lot of the material very, very valuable, depending on your season and your stage and the mess that you may be walking through yourself or walking through with someone else. Mm-hmm. Heidi, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. This is always fun, and I love hearing from people. So definitely check in over at HeidiGoehmann.com, or send me a note on my Facebook page or Instagram.
Absolutely. And then we'll enjoy the rest of the day, Heidi,
right.
celebrating Finding Hope. Happy birthday to Finding Hope.
Yes.
Viewers, we'll see you next time. Thanks, Heidi.
Thanks.